Welcome to Spectral Margins, where the veil between the living and the damned is less of a barrier and more of a revolving door with a faulty lock. Step through if you dare, but don't expect to step back. Some doors don't close. Some sins have longer memories than their sinners. And some nightmares, well, let's just say they have a nasty habit of leaving the dream with you. Tonight, we bring two stories, two unsettling reminders that some mistakes don't just haunt you, they own you. First, a man wakes to a darkness deeper than night itself. The kind of darkness you don't just see, but owe. And when it comes to knocking, it doesn't leave a courtesy note. It collects. This is Just Desserts, written by Thomas Mowen and performed by Kris Konkol.
Ryan woke with a gasp. It was pitch black, middle of the night. He glanced with disgust at Cheryl lying next to him before pulling himself out of the bed and then to the bathroom. Light on, look in the mirror. He looked like hell. Another nightmare. Of course. His eyes were bloodshot and his beard stubble was thick. He clearly hadn't shaved for days, though he remembered doing so last night. The thought didn't catch on as the nausea rapidly overtook him. Pulling himself up from the toilet, he wiped his mouth. He knew the overwhelming taste of the vomit would be there for the rest of the night. Collapsing into the empty bed, he thought briefly of Cheryl. Never satisfied, never good enough, always wanting too fucking much, but oddly, he still missed her. He woke up. How much later, he had no idea. He was wet and drenched in sweat, and to his shock, blood. He was alone in the bed, no surprise there. His heart was beating hard, violently, almost pounding itself out of his chest. Each time he swallowed, it was hard, difficult, and that's when he heard it. As he did, he knew it was no surprise. Somehow, he'd long been expecting it. A loud, gurgling rasp, coupled with a wet, violent pounding at the apartment's front door. The way it sounded, the door would give way any minute. Struggling out of bed, he stumbled hard over to the bedroom closet door. Grabbing out of it the shovel he and Cheryl would use when they'd go camping together, he jammed it under the bedroom doorknob, bolting the door. Suddenly, the front door gave way, breaking open with the sound of twisted wood and metal. As Ryan stumbled against the bed with rising terror, he finally remembered. His hands around Cheryl's neck. Her eyes bulged wide as she gasped. This is taking too long, he'd thought to himself, so he started to pummel her face with his fists. He saw clearly as if it had happened moments ago, her facial structure shift and break under his fists. He saw the blood come to cover her face, and then his fists. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she was gone, her body vacant before him. And that's when the reality, the clarity had set in. His life was over. Over. There was no walking away from this. And from there, the next step was easy. A full bathtub, a razor slicing his arms open. And what came next was eternity. But eternity wasn't what he'd expected. How long had it been now? Days, weeks, months? All leading up to this point, to his true eternity. The bedroom door broke open, and Ryan saw his destiny before him. Tall and disgusting and vicious and panting with violent hunger. He screamed as the teeth closed around him, knowing that there would be no escape ever again, not even death. You see, there's no escaping hell.
And that was Just Desserts, written by Thomas Mowen and performed by Kris Konkol. A cautionary tale for those who think they can outrun the past. Turns out, karma doesn't just have your address, it's got a spare key. But guilt isn't the only thing that lingers. Some things don't just stain the soul, they sink in. Deeper than ink, deeper than flesh. And when they move, you feel it. Our next tale takes us into the world of obsession, artistry, and a little something I like to call buyer's remorse. Written by Frederick Meyers and performed by Goroff, I give you Hellion.
The creature burned his flesh with an exalted look of fiendish joy. Franklin Barlow sat motionless, eyeing the latest addition to his collection. "Creepy little thing, isn't it?" the artist asked, setting down his tattoo machine. "Give me a minute and I'll wipe it down so you can take a closer look." Franklin rolled his eyes. He was paying the man by the hour and counted 3 breaks in this session alone. He hated it when people wasted his time. The artist wiped down his chest and Franklin stood to examine himself in the studio's 6-foot vanity mirror. He had always been a fan of tattoos, but recently it had become an obsession. It started with one, like things often do, a giant horned bull on his calf. From there, he was off to the races with a pair of praying hands on his back. He wasn't religious, but he liked the aesthetic. A beautiful black and gray pocket watch on his right forearm and a blooming rose on the left side of his neck. Next was a blue jay on his stomach, admittedly a drunken whim. Then the script, "Authentic Franklin," across his collarbone. Lastly, he spared no expense and found the best artist in the city to do a realistic photo portrait on his left arm of a beautiful woman with flowing dark hair, deep, thoughtful eyes, and a fair, freckled complexion. This latest tattoo, though, was different. He had accidentally stumbled across the gruesome little thing on one of his many nights spent down an internet rabbit hole with a liquor bottle in hand and heavy metal music on the stereo. Something about the devilish image called to him, and he woke hungover the following day with a copy of it sitting in his printer, unsure of where he'd even found it. "What do you think?" Franklin studied the tattoo in the full-length mirror. The tiny creature was an exact match to the image he had provided, its bald, lazy head and smooth baby face shaded to perfection. 2 translucent ears drooped on each side of its round head, its eyes a lurid red-yellow like 2 bleeding egg yolks. The baby monster's mouth took up half of its face. Its box-shaped jaw was broad and square and hinged flat like a Christmas nutcracker displaying neat rows of white, mashing teeth. On top of its head, barely visible, protruded 2 tiny stumped horns. Franklin was delighted. "It's all right," he shrugged, not wanting to tip his hand and give the man a reason to expect a big tip. The artist seemed hurt by the response. "Okay then, let's get you covered up. If you step over here, Frank, will not Frank," Franklin growled, turning away from the mirror to shoot daggers at the artist. "It's Franklin." "I'm sorry. When you're ready, we'll cover you up." The artist hung his head like a scolded puppy and quietly began to clean up. Franklin glanced back into the mirror. The newly inked creature on his chest was gone. It now stood perched on his shoulder like some deviant parrot. It had grown to the size of a small cat and sat facing him, its slimy black tongue dancing hypnotically over its teeth towards Franklin's ear. He screamed, swatting wildly in its direction. "Everything okay?" Franklin looked down, and the tiny creature was back where it belonged, minuscule droplets of his own blood still seeping from around its devilish face and body. He poked the tender skin of the new tattoo, half expecting it to move. But the image remained frozen, smiling. He really needed to lay off the pills. "Yeah, fine," he muttered, walking over to the table. "Hurry up, let's get this over with." Franklin stood in the bathroom of his Upper East Side apartment, admiring himself in the mirror like some rare exhibit. While mere art to the undiscerning eye, his tattoos held a much deeper meaning to him. The bull represented what he wanted out of life and what he was willing to do to get it. He had always been one to go over or through anybody or anything that got in the way of his goals regardless of circumstance. "Better to play the bully than the victim," his father had always said. One of his favorites was the beautiful woman on his arm. It represented his ability with women. He considered himself a ladies' man who had left quite a few broken hearts and homes in the wake of his desires. He treated women as nothing more than a challenge, trophies to be won and discarded, a sick game played at others' expense. Satisfied, Franklin took one final look at his new tattoo, cleaned it carefully, and called it a night. The next day, the rose tattoo on his neck began to wilt. He stood in his bedroom, anger rising like smoke through a chimney. The once vibrant flower looked dry and dead, its faded petals withered and cracked. This was the artist's fault somehow. He knew it. A chemical reaction from cheap or dirty equipment. That asshole would pay for this. Nobody messed with him and got away with it, especially some lowlife. He would make an example of the guy, he promised himself. He showered, applied lotion on the rose tattoo to no avail, then collapsed on the large leather sofa in the living room to plot revenge. A screeching noise echoed throughout the apartment, pulling him from an afternoon nap. Startled, he sat up and grabbed a samurai sword from its display stand on the coffee table. The apartment was silent. His pulse quickening, he crept down the hallway, sweeping each room. He checked every door and window, but found nothing. Relieved, he gathered his thoughts at the large oak dining room table. Had he dreamed the noise? It sounded so real, so close. He lifted his shirt to wipe his brow and discovered the bird tattoos on his stomach were gone. The bare skin where they used to be was red and heavily irritated, tiny scratches fanning out in all directions as if from little claws. Puzzled, he examined the rest of his body. The rose on his neck was now unrecognizable, reduced to random splattered ink like a Rorschach test. The beautiful woman on his left arm was still there, only now her thoughtful expression was changed to fear. Small tattooed ears, small tattooed tears streaming down the fair skin on her face. And on his chest sat the creature, inexplicably fully healed after just one day. His jaw dropped. The features of the sinister tattoo no longer belonged to that of a baby. The smooth skin on its face and head were now weathered and aged from time, like an old barn in the elements. He was looking at an older, fully grown version of the monster, its eyes possessing a cold and calculated evil, its unwavering smile taunting. Franklin looked closer and gasped. Hanging from the creature's grinning mouth, caught in its rows of shiny teeth, were several blue feathers. Sleep eluded him that night as he lay awake in bed, watching the ceiling fan blades chase each other in perpetual circles and trying to make sense of the day's events. He had no idea what was happening, but it would be fixed, one way or another. He thought of what he would say when he confronted the artist and hoped there would be other clients there to witness the verbal beatdown. He had not gotten to where he was by being weak and forgiving, and he wasn't about to start now. He closed his eyes, picturing the scene in his mind as sleep finally arrived. Franklin woke sometime later, lying on his back in a pool of sweat, the sticky comforter wrapped around his body in a lover's embrace with only his feet protruding from beneath it. Above, the ceiling fan now stood lifeless, the air in the bedroom heavy and stifling, the heat palpable. He glanced groggily at the digital clock on the nightstand. The temperature on it read an unbearable 85 degrees. An indiscernible noise came from across the room as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. He leaned up, took a breath of stale air, and tried to identify its source in the darkness. At the foot of the bed, two glowing yellow eyes peered back at him from between his exposed bare feet. A now human-sized version of the creature hunched over the bottom of the bed, its chin resting motionless on the edge of the mattress. As Franklin watched in horror, shiny white teeth appeared, framing a wide, insidious smile. It moved quickly toward Franklin's exposed toes and clamped down, crushing them in its powerful jaws. He screamed in agony, the crushed nerve endings in his foot sending waves of pain through his entire body like tiny lightning bolts. He rolled, crashing onto the floor. The creature moved closer, the pale moonlight from outside painting its horned head on the bedroom wall like a sinister shadow puppet. Ignoring the pain, Franklin reached desperately for the bedroom door and ripped it open, crawling into the hallway and slamming it closed behind him. His foot was a mangled mess, its big toe crushed and throbbing. Two of his toenails were missing, and blood oozed from the nail beds onto the light-colored carpet. He cried out, the sight of the damaged appendages making him feel lightheaded. Pushing through the pain, he dragged himself to his feet and limped down the hall, staggering into the bathroom. He retrieved a first aid kit from the medicine cabinet and wrapped his foot. The injured toes throbbed in a rhythm with his quickening heartbeat as blood began to soak through the gauze. It'll have to do for now, he thought, his eyes watering as he tried to remember where he had left his cell phone. Breathing deeply, he staggered out of the bathroom and back into the hall. The apartment's thermostat lay broken in pieces on the floor, ripped from the wall. He navigated around them, trying to remain quiet. As he neared the kitchen, a noise came from inside. His heart racing, he peered in cautiously. The kitchen was empty. The microwave on the counter was running. Something inside it sparked profusely. He looked closer and his heart sank. His cell phone rotated slowly on the glass plate inside, the noxious fume of melted plastic infiltrating the air. He cursed under his breath and continued down the hall. As he passed the hallway mirror, he noticed the creature on his chest had changed. It was now lying on its back, its bloody mouth hung open in uproarious laughter. He stared at it in disbelief. "This can't be happening," he yelled, as if his own voice might pull him from the depths of a strange nightmare. The creature sat up and nodded. "You are not real," Franklin shrieked, his voice wavering. The tiny monster nodded again. It winked at him, its sinister smile taunting. Franklin stood dumbfounded. "Why are you doing this?" The authentic Franklin script on his collarbone began to move, the inked letters combining to form a new word. Fear. The letters scrambled again, 3 separating from the rest, forming a second word. Fun. Franklin wiped his chest, frantically trying to erase the words.
You're screwing with the wrong guy,
he screamed. Something grazed his back. Startled, he spun it toward the mirror. The praying hands on his back moved. The once peaceful symbol of 2 touching hands separated, each prominently displaying extended middle fingers. Furious, he spun back to face the mirror. The creature's head began to swell, its jaundiced eyes and evil smile growing unnaturally large on its tiny body. Its head stretched slowly across Franklin's chest, expanding like an overinflated balloon. Without warning, the head popped, splattering his body with black ink. Clawed fingers emerged from a pool of ink on his chest like worms surfacing after rain. He screamed as a hand shot out of the ink pool, grabbing his throat. He staggered back into the living room, fighting the arm, his lungs gasping desperately for air. The powerful hand squeezed his windpipe like a vice, thin droplets of blood trickling down the side of his neck from surface lacerations. His vision began to blur, his eyesight narrowing to thin strips of fragmented light. Franklin collapsed, crashing into the coffee table as complete blackness came. The sound of heavy metal music roused him back to the conscious world. The Bose stereo on the entertainment center was on max volume, pumping guitar and drums at ear-bleeding decibels. His neighbor, Mrs. Crosby, pounded on the other side of the living room wall next to it.
What's going on over there? Turn that down. I've called the police.
Franklin moved gingerly, several scrapes and lacerations from the shattered glass coffee table making themselves known. He felt around on the living room floor, tiny pieces of glass biting at his hands. He found the sword and squeezed it firmly. Its wrapped handle felt wet and tacky in his hand. Dazed, he stumbled to the stereo, his heartbeat pounding along with the music like a percussive band member. He extended a shaky hand and turned it off, silencing the apartment. Mrs. Crosby banged again, her angry words inaudible. As he opened his mouth to reply, something moved above his head. A light on the ceiling shattered, raining down shards of glass like wintry sleet. Something scurried overhead as more fixtures exploded. Franklin shielded his eyes, scanning the ceiling, but the lack of light impaired his vision. The apartment now lay shrouded in darkness, except for a few tiny slivers of moonlight creeping in between the Venetian blinds on the nearby window. He crept toward the gas fireplace and fumbled for a flashlight on the mantel above it, switching it on. The light's beam was weak but comforting. He wiped his chest, smearing the black ink away. The creature was gone. He pointed the light overhead. A trail of black ink coated the ceiling, tiny droplets falling randomly onto the carpet. The ink circled the broken fixtures above, then trailed down the hallway and out of view. A door slammed at the end of the hall, rattling its frame. An eerie silence followed.
All right, you little fucker. You want to play?
Franklin shouted, summoning the courage. He moved carefully down the hall, sword in hand, flashlight beam leading the way. Something brushed lightly against his arm, like the thin legs of an unseen spider. Tiny hairs on his flesh stood up instinctively. Startled, he directed the light toward it. The hands on his pocket watch tattoo were moving, tickling his flesh as they crawled around the watch's face in slow rotations. He took a deep breath and continued down the dark hall, his entire body shaking with each step. Passing the hall mirror, he quickly glanced at his reflection. The tattooed letters on his body shimmered and bounced hypnotically on his skin. The hands on the pocket watch were now spinning rapidly like a helicopter's propeller. Ahead, the doorknob to his closed bedroom door began to move. It rotated slowly and then stopped abruptly, held in position by an unknown force. Franklin remained motionless in front of the mirror, too terrified to move any closer, his eyes glued to the knob. He pointed the flashlight's beam at it with an unsteady hand, hoping the light might impede any malevolence within. The doorknob rolled slowly back in the opposite direction and then stopped. A glimmer of movement in the mirror once more caught his eye. The letters were moving again, ominous in the encompassing darkness like those on a Ouija board. As he focused on the letters, the bedroom door opened, its swollen wooden hinges testing like old arthritic bones. Oblivious, Franklin watched the mirror as 3 distinct letters parted from the rest of his chest, spelling another word. He read it aloud. Run. Something large exploded from the bedroom's darkness, spilling into the hallway. An enormous bull crashed against the opposite wall, caving in the drywall. It spun and stared at Franklin, digging its hooves into the carpet. Its massive horns swung wide, knocking pictures off the walls. He recognized it instantly as the bull tattoo on his leg, only different. The glowing yellow eyes and wide mechanical jaw on its face were not the bull's, but the unmistakable features of the tattooed demon. It opened its mouth with a menacing roar, exhaling hellish flames from its nostrils. The beast charged forward, the hooves on its hind legs kicking large holes in the hallway ceiling. Franklin stood paralyzed as it thundered down the hall, its horns carving deep trenches down the length of both walls. As it rumbled closer, Franklin dropped the sword and flashlight. Fueled only by adrenaline, he ran on corpse-like legs for the apartment door. Behind him, the giant beast gained ground, bearing down on him like a freight train from hell. He could feel its hot breath just inches from his neck. With no time to spare, he arrived at the door and ripped it open, diving frantically out into the building's hallway and crashing into the opposite wall. He shielded his head with his hands, bracing for impact, but none came. Still in shock, he looked up from the floor and into the familiar face of Mrs. Crosby. 2 uniformed officers stood beside her. Other residents peered out of their apartments down the hall, their curiosity evident.
Well, well,
Mrs. Crosby muttered.
Look who finally answers the door.
Help! Franklin screamed, grasping at the tall officer's leg. It's after me! He pointed to his apartment. Sir, calm down, the officer said, examining his ink-soaked body. Have you been drinking tonight?
Every night with this one,
Mrs. Crosby retorted. Ma'am, please, the officer responded, waving her off.
See for yourselves,
Franklin pleaded. The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner. All right, he said finally. Stay here, I'll have a look. Mrs. Crosby rolled her eyes. Franklin remained on the floor as the officer drew his gun and cautiously entered the apartment. The trained officer swept the apartment with precision, saving his bedroom for last. Franklin held his breath as the officer finally arrived at the bedroom door and slipped silently inside. The officer reappeared moments later, wearing a look of revulsion. He stepped out of the room, covering his mouth with his free hand, then quickly exited the apartment. You're under arrest, he ordered, grabbing Franklin's arm. He turned to his partner, speaking in a hushed manner. Call it in. We've got a dead woman in the bedroom. Carved her up real good with a sword. Franklin attempted to free himself of the officer's grip. I didn't do it! It was him! He cried, pointing to his chest. But the only thing there was a pool of half-dried ink. He looked desperately at his leg. The bull tattoo was back. as was the clock on his arm and the script on his collarbone. The beautiful woman on his arm, though, was gone. No, not gone, he realized in horror as the officers restrained him, cuffing his hands behind his back. She was in his bedroom.
So, you're the crazy guy that carved up that woman?
The guard snickered, standing outside of the 6x8 cell.
They never did find out who she was, did they?
He crouched and extended a meaty hand through the iron bars, offering a sarcastic handshake. A large black and gray Grim Reaper tattoo adorned his muscular right forearm beneath several other tattoos. Franklin lay on the cell's metal-framed cot, staring blankly at the ceiling, his grizzled face showing the effects of stress and lack of sleep. After a moment, he sat up and turned toward the guard. "I didn't do anything." The guard threw back his head and laughed. The sound echoed down the long steel corridor.
That's what they all say.
A horn blared somewhere in the distance.
"Well, I gotta go, Frank," he said. "Don't worry about the handshake. Plenty of time for us to get to know each other in here."
He smiled, revealing crooked rows of jagged yellow teeth.
"See you around."
As the man stood to leave, the color drained from Franklin's face, his blood running ice cold. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. The Grim Reaper tattoo on the guard's arm turned and looked at Franklin, the large sigh that carried glimmering in the dim light of the corridor. And the tattoo on the guard's neck, barely visible beneath his faded blue shirt collar, was a tiny pair of horns and two lurid yellow eyes.
And that, my friends, was Hellion. Penned by Frederick Meyers and performed by Nick Goroff. A little reminder that some choices aren't just permanent. They bite back. Hard. Probably should have read the fine print in that contract. Or at least checked if the ink had a pulse. Well, before I let you slip back into the real world, if you can call it that, I want to thank all of you who joined us for last week's episode. It was a hell of a ride, and if you enjoyed hearing the return of the incomparable Jason Hill, well, you're in luck. There's plenty more of that velvet-throated devil coming your way in the nights ahead. And thank you for joining me tonight on Spectral Margins. If you enjoyed this little trip into the abyss, consider coming back next time when we once again step into the shadows, past reason, past redemption, and well beyond the margins. Until then, keep your lights low, your ears open, and if your tattoo ever starts whispering to you, maybe don't answer back. Just a thought. Good night.